On the evening of January 29, 2025, 64 people boarded American Eagle Flight 5342 at Wichita Eisenhower National Airport, bound for Washington. Among them were 28 young figure skaters, their coaches, and their families. They were heading home after the United States Figure Skating Championships. Not one of them would make it. And the most disturbing part of what happened that night is not how they died. It is how many people knew, for years, that something like this was coming, and did nothing. Flight 5342 was operated by PSA Airlines, a regional subsidiary of American Airlines. The aircraft was a Bombardier CRJ-700, registration November 709 Papa Sierra. It had been built in September of 2004. By the time it pushed back from the gate in Wichita that evening, the airplane was 20 years old. It had been flying regional routes up and down the East Coast for its entire service life. In the left seat was Captain Jonathan Campos. He was 34 years old. Campos had dreamed of flying since childhood and had worked his way up through the ranks at PSA. In the right seat was First Officer Samuel Lilley. Lilley was engaged to be married later that year. His father, Tim Lilley, was a former Black Hawk helicopter pilot. He had spent 20 years in the United States Army flying the exact same type of helicopter that would be in the sky over Washington that night. Working the cabin were flight attendants Ian Epstein and Denasia Elder. Epstein was a career changer, beloved for his humor and steady presence on flights. He left behind his wife of 23 years and 2 children. Elder was remembered by her colleagues as dedicated and kind. Behind them sat 60 passengers. Nearly half of them were connected to the world of figure skating. The United States Figure Skating Championships had wrapped up in Wichita just days earlier, and a national development camp for the country's most promising young athletes had followed. These were kids between the ages of 11 and 16, traveling with their parents and coaches, heading back east. Among them were Spencer Lane, a 16-year-old skater, and Jenna Hahn, a teenager with growing promise on the ice. Both were members of the Skating Club of Boston. Both were traveling with their mothers. Hours before departure, Spencer posted a photo to Instagram from his seat on the plane, looking out the window as it prepared for takeoff. Also on board were Yevgenia Shishkova and Vadim Naumov. They were former Russian world champions in pairs figure skating. They had won gold at the 1994 World Championships and moved to the United States in 1998. Now, they were coaches at the Skating Club of Boston. Their 23-year-old son, Maxim, had competed at the same championship event in Wichita. He had finished 4th. He had flown home earlier that week. His parents had stayed behind for the development camp. The flight from Wichita to Washington was roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was one of the few direct routes between Kansas and the East Coast. Local leaders had spent years convincing American Airlines to establish the service, and it had only been operating for about a year. For many of the skaters and their families, Flight 5342 was the most direct way home. The aircraft departed Wichita at 6:39 p.m. Eastern Time. The weather was clear. No mechanical issues were reported. The CRJ-700 climbed to its cruising altitude and settled in for an uneventful flight east. If you want to find out what was waiting for this aircraft in the sky over Washington, please hit that like button. It helps us bring these stories to more people who need to hear them. Subscribe if you have not already. Now back to Flight 5342. At 8:15 p.m., the aircraft began its descent toward Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. The crew briefed their approach. They were expecting to land on runway 1, the airport's primary runway, using the Mount Vernon visual approach from the south. The night was clear. Visibility was good. There was nothing unusual about any of it. But 300 feet above the dark surface of the Potomac River, invisible in the night sky, an Army Black Hawk helicopter was flying south along the same stretch of water. Its anti-collision transponder was not broadcasting, and the single air traffic controller handling both the helicopter and the approaching airliner had no idea how close they already were. While Flight 5342 was still cruising somewhere over the Midwest, a United States Army Black Hawk helicopter lifted off from Davison Army Airfield at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. It was 6:45 p.m. The call sign was PAT-25, Priority Air Transport. The flight had nothing to do with a mission. It was a training exercise. Specifically, it was an annual standardization evaluation for the pilot, Captain Rebecca Lobach. She was 29 years old and had accumulated roughly 450 total flight hours, about 326 of them in the Black Hawk. Sitting in the right seat was her instructor and evaluator, Chief Warrant Officer 2 Andrew Eaves. He had about 968 hours of flight time. In the back was the crew chief, a staff sergeant with roughly 1,100 hours of experience. The purpose of the flight was to evaluate Lobach's proficiency using night vision goggles. Their planned route would take them south from Fort Belvoir, then northwest through the Washington area along the Potomac River, following a series of FAA-designated helicopter routes. Route 1 ran along the western shore of the river, past the Kennedy Center, past the Lincoln Memorial, and over Memorial Bridge. At that point, the maximum altitude was 200 feet above sea level. From there, Route 4 continued south along the eastern shore of the Potomac, with Reagan National Airport directly to the west. This was a standard flight path. Army helicopters used it routinely. But there was a detail about the Black Hawk that night that would prove critical. Its ADSB transponder, the system designed to broadcast the helicopter's GPS position, altitude, and speed to other aircraft and to air traffic control, was not turned on. A Federal Aviation Administration memorandum had allowed military helicopters to fly without it. The helicopter was, for all practical purposes, nearly invisible to the advanced tracking systems that other aircraft relied on. At 8:33 p.m., when PAT-25 was about 15 miles northwest of Reagan National, the crew radioed the airport tower and requested clearance to follow Route 1 to Route 4 back to Davison Army Airfield. The controller in the tower approved the request. The helicopter continued south along the river. Inside that tower, a single air traffic controller was handling an unusually broad set of responsibilities. The operations supervisor had the staffing available to assign one controller to helicopter traffic and a separate controller to commercial aircraft. That night, the positions were combined. One person was managing everything: departures, arrivals, helicopters, all on different radio frequencies. This arrangement was later described as not normal for that time of day at Reagan National. The airport was conducting what is known as North Operations, landing most traffic on Runway 1 and intermittently using Runway 33 for smaller aircraft. Both runways were active. Helicopter Route 4 ran directly between them. What made this configuration dangerous was something that had been documented for over a decade. Between 2011 and 2024, at least one collision avoidance alert was triggered per month at Reagan National due to a helicopter flying too close to a commercial aircraft. In more than half of those cases, the helicopter appeared to be above its maximum allowed altitude. 2/3 of the incidents happened at night. In the 5 months before January 29th alone, PSA Airlines flights had received 5 separate collision warnings caused by helicopters near the airport. One of those warnings had been triggered just the day before, on January 28th, by 2 Black Hawk helicopters. None of this information had led to any changes in the routes, the procedures, or the staffing. At 8:43 p.m., Captain Campos and First Officer Lilley made contact with the Reagan National Tower. They checked in on the Mount Vernon visual approach for Runway 1. The controller came back with a question. Could they accept Runway 33 instead? It was a routine request. Runway 33 was shorter, just over 5,200 feet, but it was commonly used for smaller regional jets like the CRJ-700. Wind conditions favored it that night. The crew accepted. That decision changed their flight path. Instead of continuing straight north to Runway 1, Flight 5342 would now need to circle to the west and line up with Runway 33 from the south. This new approach would bring the aircraft low over the Potomac River, descending through 300 feet, directly across the path of helicopter Route 4. At that moment, PAT-25 was crossing the tidal basin, heading south. Flight 5342 was coming from the south, heading north. They were now flying toward each other, and only one person in the entire system was watching both of them. At 8:46 and 1 second, the controller in the tower transmitted a traffic advisory to the helicopter. He told the crew of PAT-25 that there was a CRJ just south of the Wilson Bridge at 1,200 feet, circling to Runway 33. 7 seconds later, the helicopter crew responded. They said they had the traffic in sight. They requested visual separation. The controller approved it. But investigators would later determine that the aircraft the helicopter crew believed they were watching was most likely not Flight 5342. It was a different airplane. The NTSB called it expectation bias. The crew of PAT-25 saw an aircraft in the sky and assumed it was the one they had been told about. They never confirmed the type. They never confirmed the direction. They simply saw lights in the air, believed it was the CRJ, and continued flying south. At that same moment, the controller cleared a departing jet for takeoff on runway 1 with no delay. His attention shifted. The workload was building. Multiple aircraft, multiple frequencies, one set of eyes. At 8:47 and 29 seconds, the cockpit of Flight 5342 received an automated traffic advisory from the TCAS system. This alert was designed to warn pilots of nearby aircraft that could pose a collision risk. But there was a critical limitation. Below 400 feet above the ground on descent, the system suppresses its audible warning. The crew would have seen a symbol appear on their display, but they would not have heard the alarm. They were in the final phase of their approach, managing airspeed, altitude, configuration, and visual contact with the runway. Their workload was at its peak. The controller never told the crew of Flight 5342 that there was a helicopter in their path. He had told the helicopter about the CRJ. He had not told the CRJ about the helicopter. At 8:47 and 39 seconds, the controller called PAT-25 again. He asked the crew to confirm they still had the CRJ in sight. In the background of the tower recording, an oral conflict alert can be heard. The system was warning the controller that two aircraft were dangerously close. 3 seconds later, the controller transmitted an instruction to PAT-25. Pass behind the CRJ. But at the exact moment those words were being spoken, someone on the helicopter keyed their microphone for 0.8 of a second. The transmissions collided. The words, "pass behind the," were blocked. The helicopter crew never heard them. What they did hear was enough of the transmission to respond. They told the controller again that they had the traffic in sight. They requested visual separation again. The controller approved it again. Inside the helicopter, the instructor, Chief Warrant Officer Eves, told Captain Lobach that he believed the controller was asking them to move to the left. 15 seconds before the collision, Eves told Lobach to make a sharp turn to the east bank of the river. She did not do it. 7 seconds before impact, Flight 5342 completed its turn and rolled out on final approach for runway 33. The aircraft was now descending directly toward the point where the helicopter was flying. The CRJ was at roughly 313 feet. The Black Hawk was at 278 feet. They were separated by 35 feet of altitude and closing. At 8:47 and 58 seconds, 1 second before impact, the cockpit voice recorder captured a verbal reaction from the crew of Flight 5342. The aircraft's nose pitched up sharply. The elevators deflected to near their maximum. Whether this was a deliberate evasive maneuver or a reflexive response, the NTSB could not determine. 1 second later, at 8:47 and 59 seconds, the Bombardier CRJ-700 and the Sikorsky Black Hawk collided 300 feet above the Potomac River, approximately half a mile southeast of runway 33. The impact was captured on multiple surveillance cameras. The two aircraft fell into the dark water together. 60 people in the cabin, 4 crew members in the cockpit and the galley, 3 soldiers in the helicopter. All 67 people were killed. Divers from the Metropolitan Police, the Coast Guard, and the FBI entered the river within the hour. The water was cold and dark. Jet fuel spread across the surface. Wreckage was scattered along the riverbed. There would be no rescues that night, only recovery. By the time the sun rose over Washington the next morning, the nation knew that something had gone terribly wrong in the sky above the Capitol. But it would take investigators months to understand just how many things had failed at the same time, and how long those failures had been building. The National Transportation Safety Board launched a full investigation within hours of the collision. A GO team was dispatched to the scene. Investigators from the FAA, the United States Army, PSA Airlines, and the Airline Pilots Association were designated as parties to the investigation. Specialized groups were formed to examine air traffic control, helicopter operations, airplane systems, structures, power plants, and human performance. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada sent a representative because the aircraft had been manufactured by Bombardier. The crash site presented enormous challenges. The Potomac River at that location was dark, cold, and contaminated with jet fuel. Wreckage from both aircraft was scattered across the riverbed. The CRJ-700 had broken apart on impact. The Black Hawk had been destroyed. Divers working in near-zero visibility began the painstaking work of recovering remains and mapping debris fields. Cranes were brought in to pull large sections of wreckage from the water. Boats lined the river for days. By the evening of January 30th, one day after the crash, the flight data recorder from Flight 5342 had been recovered and brought to the NTSB laboratory for evaluation. The helicopter's recorder was pulled from the river the following day. Both were sent for immediate download and analysis. The flight data recorder from the CRJ revealed a clean, unremarkable flight from Wichita. No mechanical anomalies, no system failures, no warnings until the final seconds. The aircraft had been functioning exactly as it should. At 8:44 and 41 seconds, the crew selected 30 degrees of flaps. 4 seconds later, 45 degrees. At 8:44 and 49, the landing gear was down and locked. The airplane was fully configured for landing 6 miles south of the airport. Everything was normal. The helicopter's recorder told a different story. PAT-25 had been flying consistently above the maximum published altitude for its route. The helicopter was at 278 feet when the collision occurred. The published limit for that section of Route 4 was 200 feet above sea level. The NTSB would later determine that the crew's barometric altimeter may have been reading 80 to 100 feet lower than the helicopter's actual altitude. The crew may not have known how high they were. The cockpit voice recorders from both aircraft were transcribed in full. The CRJ recording captured a routine flight. The crew managed frequency changes, briefed their approach, and communicated with Kansas City Center, then Potomac Approach, then Reagan Tower. There was no indication of concern until the final second, when a brief verbal reaction was captured just before the sounds of impact. Then the recording ended. The helicopter's voice recorder revealed something investigators had not expected. In the moments before the collision, the instructor pilot told Lobach that they were at 300 feet and needed to descend. The pilot acknowledged and said they would go down to 200. But the descent never happened in time. The CVR also captured the stepped-on radio transmission, confirming that the crew had keyed their microphone at the precise moment the controller was telling them to pass behind the CRJ. The critical instruction was never received. Surveillance video from multiple cameras captured the collision itself. The footage showed 2 sets of lights converging over the dark river. A brief flash, then both aircraft dropping into the water. The video was among the most widely viewed pieces of evidence in the early days of the investigation. Within 48 hours, the basic facts were clear. 2 aircraft had been on a collision course in one of the most congested airspace corridors in the United States. The helicopter was above its assigned altitude. Its transponder was not broadcasting. The controller handling both aircraft had not warned the crew of the CRJ. A critical radio transmission had been blocked, and the helicopter crew had been watching the wrong airplane. But for the NTSB, identifying what happened was only the beginning. The harder question was why. Why was a military helicopter allowed to fly through active approach corridors without a working transponder? Why was one controller managing both helicopter and fixed-wing traffic? Why had more than a decade of collision warnings at Reagan National Airport produced no meaningful changes? The answers, investigators would discover, ran far deeper than a single night. They reached into the structure of the FAA itself, into the design of the airspace, into decisions made years before anyone on Flight 5342 had ever stepped on board. The airspace above Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport is among the most complex in the world. Commercial jets, military helicopters, general aviation, Coast Guard patrols, and government transport flights all share a narrow corridor of sky squeezed between restricted zones around the White House, the Capitol, and the Pentagon. At the center of it all sits a single airport with 3 runways, surrounded by water, monuments, and no-fly zones. Helicopter Route 4 was designed decades ago as a way to move military and government rotorcraft through this airspace without interfering with commercial traffic. On paper, the system worked. Helicopters would stay low, at or below 200 feet, hugging the east bank of the Potomac. Airplanes would pass overhead at higher altitudes. The 2 streams of traffic would never meet. But the NTSB discovered that the math behind this design had a fatal flaw. When a commercial aircraft was on a standard 3-degree visual glide slope descending to runway 33, and a helicopter was flying at the maximum allowed altitude of 200 feet near the eastern shoreline, the vertical separation between them was approximately 75 feet. That is less than the wingspan of a CRJ-700. And that assumed the helicopter was exactly where it was supposed to be, at exactly the right altitude, in exactly the right position. Any deviation and the margin disappeared entirely. Think of it like 2 highways stacked on top of each other, separated by the height of a single building. The cars on the bottom road are told to stay in their lane. The cars on the top road are landing at full speed. There are no barriers between them, no sensors, no automated warnings. The only thing keeping them apart is the assumption that every driver will be exactly where they are supposed to be, every single time. For 13 years, the system had been producing near misses. It was only a matter of time before it produced a direct hit. The NTSB's investigation revealed that the FAA had data showing this risk. Between 2018 and 2024, there were over 15,000 instances in which a commercial airplane and a helicopter were within 1 nautical mile laterally and 400 feet vertically of each other near Reagan National. 85 of those encounters involved lateral separation of less than 1,500 feet and vertical separation of less than 200 feet. The numbers were not hidden. They were in the FAA's own databases. No one acted on them. The NTSB also examined why the single controller that night had not warned Flight 5342 about the helicopter. The investigation found that the controller's workload had increased significantly in the minutes before the collision. Multiple aircraft were being sequenced for arrival. A departure was being cleared on runway 1. The helicopter was on a different radio frequency from the commercial traffic. The controller was toggling between frequencies, managing converging streams of traffic with no automation to flag the developing conflict until it was too late. The oral conflict alert in the tower sounded only seconds before impact. The investigation found that the tower operations supervisor had the authority and the staffing to split the positions that night, assigning one controller to helicopter traffic and another to commercial aircraft. This was not done. The NTSB concluded that the combined position increased the controller's workload and reduced their ability to monitor developing conflicts and provide timely safety alerts. Then there was the helicopter's altitude. PAT 25 was at 278 feet at the moment of collision. The maximum for that segment of Route 4 was 200 feet. The NTSB found that the crew's barometric altimeter was subject to error tolerances that the Army had failed to ensure its pilots understood. The altimeter could read 80 to 100 feet lower than the helicopter's true altitude. The crew believed they were in compliance. They were not, and without ADSB broadcasting their position, no one on the ground had accurate data to correct them. NTSB Chairwoman Jennifer Homendy did not mince words at the public board meeting. She said she was angry. She said the FAA had data for years showing near misses along this exact corridor. She said the conditions for this tragedy were in place long before the night of January 29th. And she said 7 words that would define the investigation. This was 100% preventable. Flight 5342 was not the first warning. It was the last. The conflict between helicopters and commercial aircraft at Reagan National had been building for more than a decade. The NTSB's review of voluntary safety reports and FAA data revealed a pattern so consistent that it should have been impossible to ignore. Since 2011, at least one TCAS resolution advisory had been triggered every month at Reagan National because a helicopter had come too close to a landing or departing airplane. Every single month. for 13 years. In more than half of those events, the helicopter appeared to have been flying above its maximum permitted altitude. Two-thirds of the incidents occurred at night, when visual separation between aircraft is hardest to maintain. The FAA had access to all of this data. It was collected through their own reporting systems, and yet the helicopter routes remained unchanged. The altitude limits remained the same. The procedures for separating helicopter and fixed-wing traffic at Reagan National were not revised. The NTSB also found that the FAA's own safety management systems had failed to identify the growing risk. There was no formal process in place to aggregate the near-miss reports and evaluate whether the frequency and severity of these encounters warranted a change in airspace design. The data existed in multiple databases, but no one was connecting the dots. The system was designed to collect information. It was not designed to act on it. The Army's safety culture came under scrutiny as well. Investigators found that the Army's internal reporting systems for pilots were not well utilized. Helicopter crews who had experienced close encounters with commercial aircraft near Reagan National had not consistently reported those events through the Army's safety channels. As a result, Army leadership lacked a clear picture of how frequently its helicopters were coming into dangerous proximity with airliners in the Washington corridor. The question of ADS-B was particularly troubling. Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast is a system that transmits an aircraft's GPS position, altitude, ground speed, and identification once per second. It is one of the most basic tools of modern air traffic awareness. Commercial aircraft are required to have it, but at the time of the crash, a memorandum from the FAA allowed military helicopters to operate near Reagan National with their ADS-B turned off. The stated reason was operational security. NTSB Chairwoman Homendy revealed during the investigation that she had personally met with FAA Administrator Michael Whitaker in August of 2024, 5 months before the crash, to urge the agency to require ADS-B in for commercial aircraft. This upgraded system would have allowed the crew of Flight 5342 to see the helicopter's position on their display, with directional traffic symbols showing exactly where it was and which way it was moving. The NTSB later concluded that such a system could have provided the CRJ crew with their first alert about the helicopter 59 seconds before the collision. Nearly a full minute of warning. Whitaker told Homendy the system was not needed. The reliance on visual separation was another systemic failure the NTSB identified. In the congested airspace around Reagan National, controllers routinely approved requests for visual separation, placing the burden on pilots to see and avoid other aircraft. This worked in daylight, at higher altitudes, with transponders broadcasting and controllers actively monitoring. But at night, at 300 feet, with a dark helicopter flying against the dark water of the Potomac River, visual separation was an abstraction. The helicopter had low conspicuity. It showed almost no apparent motion against the background from the CRJ's perspective. The NTSB concluded that the crew of Flight 5342 did not see the helicopter until it was too late because of their high workload during the final approach, and because the helicopter was effectively invisible to them. The investigation also noted a grim historical echo. In 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 had crashed into the 14th Street Bridge over the Potomac after a failed takeoff from Reagan National, killing 78 people. That disaster had led to sweeping changes in de-icing procedures and crew resource management. 43 years later, the Potomac had claimed another aircraft, and once again, the failures were systemic, known, documented, and unaddressed. The question was no longer what went wrong on January 29th. The question was how many layers of protection had been quietly stripped away year after year, until there was nothing left between a helicopter and an airliner but 75 feet of empty air and the hope that everyone would be exactly where they were supposed to be. On February 17, 2026, nearly 13 months after the collision, the National Transportation Safety Board released its final report. The board had voted unanimously to approve 74 findings and 50 safety recommendations. 33 of those recommendations were directed at the Federal Aviation Administration. 8 went to the United States Army. The rest were distributed among the Department of Defense, PSA Airlines, and other agencies. The probable causes were not systemic. They were systemic. The NTSB concluded that the crash was caused by the FAA's placement of Helicopter Route 4 in dangerous proximity to the approach path for runway 33. By the FAA's failure to provide procedural separation between helicopters and commercial aircraft. By the over-reliance on visual separation in congested airspace at night. By the helicopter crew's error in identifying the wrong aircraft as Flight 5342. By the air traffic controller's loss of situational awareness due to high workload from managing combined positions, and by the Army's failure to ensure its pilots understood the error tolerances of barometric altimeters in their helicopters. It was not one mistake. It was every safeguard failing at the same time. The changes began before the final report was even published. Within days of the crash, the FAA issued a notice to airmen restricting all helicopter traffic over the Potomac River near Reagan National Airport. Route 4 between Haynes Point and the Wilson Bridge was effectively shut down for all but emergency, law enforcement, and presidential transport flights. On January 31st, American Airlines retired flight number 5342 permanently. The Wichita to Washington route was reassigned to Flight 5677. The FAA mandated that military helicopters operating near Reagan National must have their ADS-B transponders active except during specific national security missions. The Army issued new directives requiring its pilots to receive additional training on altimeter error tolerances and their implications for low-altitude flight in controlled airspace. The NTSB recommended that the FAA redesign helicopter routes in the Washington area to ensure adequate separation from commercial approach and departure corridors. The board also recommended that all commercial aircraft be equipped with ADS-BN, the upgraded system that would display nearby traffic with directional symbols and provide earlier collision warnings. The board recommended that the Reagan National Tower implement formal procedures to ensure helicopter and commercial aircraft control positions are separated during periods of elevated traffic. And they recommended that the FAA fully implement its time-based flow management system at Potomac Approach and reassess the airport's arrival rate in light of its airspace complexity and traffic volume. In total, the investigation produced the most comprehensive set of recommendations the NTSB had issued for a single accident in years. On March 2, 2025, just over a month after the crash, the figure skating community gathered at Capital One Arena in Washington for Legacy on Ice. Olympic champions Brian Boitano and Kristi Yamaguchi hosted the event. Dozens of skaters performed, including current national champions and Olympic medalists. The arena was full. The tributes were personal. Maxim Naumov, the 23-year-old son of Evgenia Shishkova and Vadim Naumov, took the ice that night. His parents had been on Flight 5342. He had competed at the same championship in Wichita and had flown home earlier in the week. He skated to a song called "The City That Is Not There." It had been his father's favorite. In Wichita, the figure skating club installed a permanent memorial on the ice at the Wichita Ice Center. It bears the city's flag, a pair of skates, and the words, "Forever in Our Hearts." At Port Hueneme, California, near the site where another aviation tragedy had once brought a community to its knees, the nation now had a new wound to carry. In Washington, first responders who had pulled wreckage and remains from the freezing Potomac in the days after the crash spoke of the toll it took. There were no rescues, only recovery. 67 people lost their lives over the Potomac River on January 29, 2025. 28 of them were part of the figure skating community. 11 of them were children. They had spent the week before doing what they loved, skating in front of judges and coaches who believed in their futures. They boarded a routine flight home, and they flew into an airspace that had been quietly failing for 13 years. But because of what investigators found, helicopter routes at Reagan National were redesigned. ADS-B requirements were expanded. Controller staffing procedures were reformed. And 50 recommendations were issued to make sure that the 75 feet of empty air between a helicopter route and a runway approach path would never again be the only thing standing between life and death. If this story stayed with you, please do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are telling the stories behind the flights that changed aviation forever. The crashes, the heroes, the investigations that made flying the safest way to travel. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States? United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Our community is growing every single day. You are not just a viewer. You are part of making sure these stories and the people in them are never forgotten. 67 people lost their lives on Flight 5342. But because of what investigators found, the skies over Washington will never be the same. And that change is already protecting every single person who flies into Reagan National Airport today. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being here.